At 6:47 in the evening on November 2nd, 1985, Colin Thompson sat across from Vitaly Yurchenko. They were at Au Pied de Cochon, a French restaurant in Georgetown, Washington, District of Columbia. Thompson, a Central Intelligence Agency handler, had spent 3 months debriefing the highest-ranking Committee for State Security officer. This officer was the highest ranking ever to defect to the United States. Yurchenko was 49 years old. He was a 25-year veteran of the Committee for State Security. He served as deputy chief of the First Chief Directorate's American operations. In 3 months, he had identified 2 Soviet spies inside American intelligence. He had revealed operations worth billions. He had provided details on Committee for State Security methods that changed American counterintelligence forever. Tonight, he had asked Thompson to take him to this specific restaurant. The restaurant was located 1.5 miles from the Soviet embassy. Yurchenko stood up from the table. He asked Thompson what Thompson would do if he simply stood up and walked out. He then asked if Thompson would shoot him. Thompson hesitated. Protocol said to maintain visual contact. Common sense said a man asking that question was about to run. Thompson replied that they did not treat defectors that way. Yurchenko smiled. He told Thompson he would return in 15 or 20 minutes. He added that if he did not return, it would not be Thompson's fault. He walked out the door. 15 minutes became 30. 30 became 1 hour. Colin Thompson realized what had happened. The highest value Soviet defector in Central Intelligence Agency history had just walked up Wisconsin Avenue. He disappeared behind the gates of the Soviet embassy compound. 3 months of intelligence had been gathered. 2 American spies were exposed. Hundreds of hours of debriefing had taken place. Central Intelligence Agency officials had celebrated the biggest intelligence coup since World War II. Now, all of it was gone. On November 4th, 1985, Soviet diplomats called an emergency press conference at their embassy. The world watched as Vitaly Yurchenko appeared before cameras. He was very much alive and very much Soviet again. He told reporters that he had been kidnapped in Rome. He claimed he was drugged and held prisoner in a Virginia house against his will. He said he escaped due to a momentary lapse in his captor's attention. The Central Intelligence Agency story was different. Yurchenko had defected voluntarily on August 1st, 1985, in Rome. He had cooperated fully for 3 months. He had exposed Edward Lee Howard, a Central Intelligence Agency traitor who had fled to Moscow. He had identified Ronald Pelton, a National Security Agency analyst who had sold submarine surveillance secrets to the Committee for State Security. He had also provided thousands of pages of intelligence on Soviet operations. Then he had changed his mind. Someone was lying. Either Yurchenko had been kidnapped and drugged, or the Central Intelligence Agency had bungled the most important defection of the Cold War. The debate would rage for decades. People questioned whether Yurchenko was a genuine defector who redefected. They also wondered if the entire thing had been an elaborate Committee for State Security operation from the start. The truth, as it emerged from Central Intelligence Agency files, Soviet archives, and the accounts of those involved, was far stranger than either story. This is the tale of Vitaly Yurchenko. He was the man who gave the Central Intelligence Agency 5,000 pieces of intelligence. He then walked back into Soviet custody 93 days later. He also lived to tell about it. His story changed Cold War espionage. His actions exposed flaws in how America handled defectors. His fate demonstrated that in the intelligence game, nothing is ever quite what it seems. And 40 years later, we still do not have all the answers. Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko was born May 2nd, 1936, in the village of Bolshoye Shkundino, Smolensk Oblast, Soviet Russia. His father, Sergei, worked in a factory. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Sergei Yurchenko went to war. He died at the siege of Leningrad in 1942. Vitaly was 6 years old. Growing up in post-war Soviet Russia shaped him. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II, had killed 27 million Soviet citizens. The victory over fascism became the founding myth of Yurchenko's generation. Service to the motherland was not a choice. It was destiny. Yurchenko enrolled in the Leningrad Higher Naval School of Submarine Navigation. He was smart, disciplined, and fluent in languages. He graduated with honors and was commissioned a lieutenant in the Soviet Navy. In 1959, at age 23, he received an offer that would define his life. The Committee for State Security wanted him. The Committee for State Security was the Soviet Union's sword and shield. It handled foreign intelligence, domestic surveillance, counterintelligence, and political policing. If the Communist Party was the brain of the Soviet state, the Committee for State Security was its nervous system. Yurchenko joined the 3rd Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence in the armed forces. His job was finding spies inside the Soviet military. He was good at it. In 1975, he transferred to the 1st Chief Directorate. This was the Committee for State Security's foreign intelligence arm. His new department was Line KR, which handled counterintelligence operations against American and Canadian intelligence services. His mission included protecting Committee for State Security officers abroad from Central Intelligence Agency recruitment. He also worked to find Central Intelligence Agency spies inside the Committee for State Security. Finally, he ran operations to identify American intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. From 1975 to 1980, Yurchenko served in Washington District of Columbia as security officer at the Soviet Embassy. His cover was assistant consul. His real job was keeping an eye on Soviet diplomats to prevent defections, watching for Central Intelligence Agency surveillance, and identifying opportunities to recruit Americans with access to secrets. Washington was a target-rich environment. Potential assets included State Department employees, military officers, defense contractors, and congressional staffers. Anyone with a security clearance and a weakness could be recruited. Yurchenko thrived. From 1975 to 1980, he operated in Washington with impunity. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Counterintelligence Division watched the Soviet embassy. However, with 300 Soviet diplomats in Washington, only a fraction of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents could watch them. Therefore, surveillance was sporadic at best. During those years, something else happened. Yurchenko fell in love. Her name was Valentina Yeroskovsky. She was the wife of a Soviet diplomat. She was elegant, educated, and politically savvy. She was married. He was also married. Soviet society did not approve, and Committee for State Security regulations absolutely forbade it. They had an affair anyway. When Valentina's husband was transferred to Canada in the late 1970s, Yurchenko's heart broke. When his own posting in Washington ended in 1980, he returned to Moscow. However, he never forgot her. From 1980 to 1985, Yurchenko rose through the Committee for State Security ranks. He became deputy chief of the 1st Chief Directorate's American Department. His office was at Yasenevo, the Committee for State Security's sprawling headquarters complex southwest of Moscow. His responsibility was overseeing all Committee for State Security operations targeting the United States and Canada. He had access to everything. This included agent networks, technical operations, and counterintelligence investigations. He knew the identities of every Committee for State Security officer operating in North America. He also knew the names of every American citizen spying for the Soviet Union. He knew where the bodies were buried, quite literally. By 1985, Vitaly Yurchenko was one of the most knowledgeable intelligence officers in the Soviet Union regarding American operations. He knew secrets worth billions. These included operations spanning decades and the names of agents the Central Intelligence Agency had spent years recruiting. And he was miserable. His marriage had failed. His career had stagnated. At 49 years old, he had reached the rank of colonel, but further promotion seemed unlikely. He drank heavily. Soviet colleagues noticed his depression. He talked constantly about Valentina Yeroskovsky. She was the woman in Canada he could not have, and she represented the life he could not live. In July 1985, the Committee for State Security sent Yurchenko to Rome. His mission was to oversee security at the Soviet embassy. He also assisted with a personnel matter. Additionally, he spent a few days conducting routine business. On August 1st, 1985, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Yurchenko told his colleagues he wanted to visit the Vatican Museum alone. He never came back. Instead, he walked to the United States Embassy on Via Veneto. He approached the Marine Guard at the gate. He told the guard in English that he was a colonel in the Committee for State Security. He stated that he wished to defect to the United States. The Marine did not blink. This happened occasionally when Soviet citizens sought asylum. Embassy protocol was clear. They were to take them inside and call the Central Intelligence Agency. Within hours, Yurchenko was on a secure Central Intelligence Agency aircraft. Its destination was Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland. His defection was codenamed CKS Fear. The Central Intelligence Agency scrambled its senior Soviet operations officers. This was the catch of the decade. On August 2nd, 1985, Yurchenko arrived in the United States. The Central Intelligence Agency took him to a safe house in Oakton, Virginia. This was 22 miles south of Washington, near Fredericksburg. The property spanned 500 acres. It was wooded and secure. It had laser beam perimeter alarms, guards, and complete isolation from the outside world. The debriefing began immediately. Aldrich Ames, a Central Intelligence Agency counterintelligence officer, led the team. Michael Rochford from the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined him. Colin Thompson, a veteran Central Intelligence Agency Soviet analyst, arrived on day 2. He became Yurchenko's primary handler. Yurchenko talked and talked and talked. The first revelation came in early August 1985. Yurchenko stated that a Central Intelligence Agency officer had betrayed them. This officer had been fired before he could be posted to Moscow. Yurchenko said the Central Intelligence Agency called him Mr. Robert. The Committee for State Security had recruited him in 1984. He had given them everything about Moscow operations. The Central Intelligence Agency froze. They knew exactly who Yurchenko meant. That individual was Edward Lee Howard. Howard had been a Central Intelligence Agency case officer recruited for Moscow Station in the early 1980s. During his training, he had learned the identities of Central Intelligence Agency assets in the Soviet Union. He also knew the locations of safe houses, communication protocols, and surveillance detection routes. He had learned everything an officer needed to run operations in Moscow. Then, during a routine polygraph examination, Howard admitted to petty theft and drug use. The Central Intelligence Agency fired him in 1983. Nobody thought to debrief him on what he knew. Nobody monitored him after termination. Nobody considered that a fired Central Intelligence Agency officer with knowledge of Moscow operations might become a security risk. Howard had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington in 1984 and sold everything he knew. By the time Yurchenko defected in August 1985, Howard had been spying for the Soviets for over 1 year. He had compromised multiple operations. Central Intelligence Agency assets in Moscow had been arrested. Some had disappeared. The Central Intelligence Agency had blamed bad luck. They also blamed operational errors and Soviet counterintelligence skill. Yurchenko told them the truth. Edward Lee Howard had sold them out. The Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately launched surveillance on Howard, who lived in New Mexico. However, Howard had been trained in Central Intelligence Agency surveillance detection techniques. On September 21, 1985, he executed an escape plan worthy of a spy thriller. Howard and his wife Mary went for a drive. Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance followed. At a curve in the road, Mary ducked down. Meanwhile, Howard, who was in the passenger seat, popped up a dummy made from clothes and a wig stand. Mary then drove home with the dummy Howard in the passenger seat. This fooled the Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance team outside their house. The real Edward Lee Howard, meanwhile, had jumped from the car during the turn. He disappeared into the night. He made his way to Mexico, then to Moscow. He was the Central Intelligence Agency's first officer to defect to the Soviet Union. He lived in Moscow until his death in 2002. This death was allegedly from a fall downstairs. Some suspected Committee for State Security involvement because Howard knew too much. Dead men tell no tales. But Yurchenko's revelations did not stop with Howard. The second revelation came in mid-August 1985. Yurchenko said there was someone in the National Security Agency. This individual had sold information about submarine operations. This included technical surveillance of Soviet communications cables under the Sea of Okhotsk. This was catastrophic. Yurchenko did not know the man's name. However, he knew the details. The spy had worked at the National Security Agency. He had left the agency. He also had financial problems. He had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington in January 1980 and volunteered. He had described a top-secret operation called Ivy Bells. Ivy Bells was one of America's crown jewels. United States submarines placed recording devices on Soviet undersea communication cables. These cables were located in the Sea of Okhotsk, off the Siberian coast. The cables carried Soviet military communications, including nuclear submarine deployments, missile test data, and naval orders. The intelligence gained was priceless. The spy had told the KGB everything. The Soviets had located the tap, retrieved it, and put it on display in a Moscow museum. This served as proof of American espionage. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Security Agency launched a mole hunt. They reviewed everyone who had access to Ivy Bells. They cross-referenced financial problems. They looked for anyone who had contacted the Soviet embassy. They found him. They found Ronald William Pelton. He was a former National Security Agency communications specialist. Pelton was fluent in Russian. He worked at the National Security Agency from 1965 to 1979. He had resigned due to financial problems and was divorced, bankrupt, and deep in debt. On November 25, 1985, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents arrested Pelton at his home in Maryland. In his trial, prosecutors revealed he had received $35,000 from the KGB. This was for revealing Ivy Bells and 4 other signals intelligence programs. He was convicted of espionage. He was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences. He was released in 2015 after serving 30 years. He died in 2022 at age 80. He was largely forgotten except by counterintelligence professionals. They remembered him as the man who sold America's submarine surveillance secrets for the cost of a used car. Yurchenko had given the Central Intelligence Agency 2 major American spies in his first 2 weeks of debriefing. But the intelligence kept coming. Throughout August and September 1985, Yurchenko provided details on KGB operations. These details filled thousands of pages of Central Intelligence Agency reports. This was specific, actionable, and verifiable intelligence. He identified KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover in the United States and Canada. He identified their names, assignments, and cover jobs. The Central Intelligence Agency could now track them and understand their patterns. This gave them the potential to recruit these officers. He described KGB recruitment techniques. He showed how the KGB identified vulnerable Americans. He also detailed which approaches worked and which did not. The Central Intelligence Agency used this information to train its officers. This training focused on resisting foreign recruitment. He revealed KGB surveillance methods in Moscow. He detailed how the KGB followed Central Intelligence Agency officers. He revealed the technologies they used. He also showed where they placed cameras. The Central Intelligence Agency used this to improve its Moscow station tradecraft. He explained KGB counterintelligence procedures. He detailed how the KGB investigated suspected American spies within Soviet borders. He also described what red flags triggered investigations. The Central Intelligence Agency used this to better protect its assets. He discussed the case of Adolf Tolkachev. Tolkachev was a Soviet aviation engineer who had spied for the Central Intelligence Agency from 1978 to 1985. Tolkachev, codenamed CKS Fear, had provided intelligence on Soviet radar and avionics technology. This intelligence was worth an estimated $2 billion. He had been arrested in June 1985, just 2 months before Yurchenko defected. Yurchenko's information suggested Tolkachev had been betrayed by Edward Lee Howard. The Central Intelligence Agency believed him. Years later, they would learn Tolkachev had actually been betrayed by Aldrich Ames. Ames was sitting in the debriefing room taking notes while Yurchenko talked. The irony was brutal. The Central Intelligence Agency officer debriefing Yurchenko about Soviet penetrations was himself a Soviet penetration. But in August 1985, nobody knew. Ames would not be caught until 1994. The Central Intelligence Agency considered Yurchenko's defection the intelligence coup of the decade. Director of Central Intelligence William Casey personally reviewed the reports. The Federal Bureau of Investigation got convictions based on his information. North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies received briefings on KGB methods. American intelligence tradecraft changed based on his revelations. Then, in October 1985, things started going wrong. Yurchenko was depressed. Colin Thompson, his Central Intelligence Agency handler, noticed it immediately. Yurchenko drank heavily. He slept poorly. He talked obsessively about Valentina Yeroskovsky. She was the Soviet diplomat's wife he had loved in the late 1970s. She was his obsession. She was his one regret. He claimed the reason he had defected was to be with her. The Central Intelligence Agency arranged a secret meeting. In early October 1985, they took Yurchenko to Ottawa, Canada. Valentina now lived there with her husband. The meeting was arranged through secure Central Intelligence Agency and Canadian intelligence channels. Valentina showed up at the safe house. Yurchenko poured his heart out. He told her he had defected for her. He wanted her to come to America with him, to start a new life together. He said he had money, and the Central Intelligence Agency would protect them. Valentina looked at him like he was insane. Valentina told him she was a married Soviet woman. She said she loved her husband. She added that she had no interest in defecting or in him. She left. Yurchenko was devastated. The romantic fantasy that had sustained him through 3 months of debriefings collapsed. The woman he loved had rejected him. This happened in front of Central Intelligence Agency officers in a foreign country with no way back for him. He had betrayed the Soviet Union for a woman who did not want him. His depression deepened significantly. He drank more. He became irritable during debriefings and complained about his treatment. The safe house felt like a prison to him, and the guards felt like captors. Colin Thompson, his handler, seemed cold and dismissive. The Central Intelligence Agency tried to accommodate him. They moved him to better housing. They offered him money, more freedom, and plans for his new life in America. They suggested he write a book to start fresh and build something new. Yurchenko was not interested. On October 31st, 1985, Halloween, Colin Thompson took Yurchenko to see the Georgetown Halloween parade. Yurchenko seemed to enjoy it. He enjoyed the crowds, the costumes, and the normalcy. 2 days later, on November 2nd, 1985, Yurchenko asked Thompson to take him to dinner at Au Pied de Cochon. Thompson agreed. It seemed like a reasonable request. Yurchenko was a defector, not a prisoner. He had cooperated fully. Taking him to a restaurant in Georgetown seemed harmless. At 6:47 post-meridian, Vitaly Yurchenko stood up from the table at Au Pied de Cochon. He looked at Colin Thompson. He asked what would happen if he walked out. Thompson said nothing would happen. Yurchenko walked out the door. He turned right on Wisconsin Avenue and walked north. He walked 1.5 miles to the Soviet embassy. It was located at 2650 Wisconsin Avenue Northwest. He walked straight to the gate, identified himself to the guards, and asked to be let in. The KGB officers inside could not believe it. Vitaly Yurchenko, who had defected 3 months ago, was standing at their door. He was asking to come home. They let him in. On November 4th, 1985, the Soviet embassy held an emergency press conference. American media packed the room, cameras rolled, the world watched. Vitaly Yurchenko, looking healthy and confident, sat before the microphones. Yurchenko claimed he was kidnapped in Rome on August 1st. He spoke in Russian using an interpreter. He stated that Central Intelligence Agency agents drugged him and transported him against his will. He said he was held as a prisoner in a guarded house near Fredericksburg, Virginia. There, he was questioned constantly. He described the prison in detail. He mentioned its 500 acres. He described laser alarms, guards, and isolation. He named Colin Thompson as his captor. He claimed he had been drugged, coerced, and psychologically tortured. He claimed that on November 2nd, due to a momentary lapse of attention, he was able to break out to freedom. He said he then reached the Soviet embassy. He denied defecting voluntarily. He also denied providing any Soviet secrets. He denied betraying his country. He declared that American Special Services had kidnapped him. He called this act one of state terrorism. The Soviet government backed his story completely. TASS, the Soviet news agency, accused the United States of kidnapping and torture. Soviet diplomats demanded an apology. The incident became a propaganda victory for Moscow. This occurred just weeks before a planned summit between President Ronald Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. The State Department called a competing press conference. They categorically denied Yurchenko's story. A State Department spokesman stated that Vitaly Yurchenko defected voluntarily on August 1st in Rome. He had requested asylum. The spokesman said Yurchenko cooperated fully with American authorities. He added that Yurchenko was free to leave at any time. The spokesman denied Yurchenko was drugged, coerced, or imprisoned. He concluded that Yurchenko chose to return to the Soviet embassy of his own free will. The spokesman did not mention Edward Lee Howard. He did not mention Ronald Pelton. He also did not reveal the intelligence Yurchenko had provided. The Central Intelligence Agency was humiliated. The highest value Soviet defector in decades had redefected. This happened in the middle of Washington District of Columbia after 3 months of debriefing. The media had a field day. They questioned if the Central Intelligence Agency was so incompetent it could not keep a willing defector happy. They wondered if the agency had really kidnapped a Soviet officer. They also considered if this was a KGB disinformation operation. Nobody knew. On November 6, 1985, Vitaly Yurchenko boarded an Aeroflot flight. The flight departed from Washington Dulles International Airport to Moscow. American officials, under diplomatic protocol, had no choice but to let him go. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents at the airport photographed him boarding the plane. He looked calm. He appeared relaxed. He seemed ready to go home. When the plane landed in Moscow, KGB officers met him on the tarmac. The American intelligence community held its breath. Soviet defectors who returned usually faced execution. They usually faced show trials or decades in the gulag. Nobody came back from betraying the KGB and lived. But Vitaly Yurchenko did not disappear. In March 1986, the Soviet embassy in Washington released a statement. The statement confirmed Vitaly Yurchenko was alive, in good health, and working in Moscow. In August 1986, a Moscow newspaper published an interview with Yurchenko. He said he was back at his old job. He was a security officer for Soviet embassies abroad. He said he faced no punishment, no prison, and no trial. Rumors spread. People questioned if Yurchenko had been executed in secret. They wondered if the interview was staged. They also considered if someone was impersonating him. In April 1986, Yurchenko gave another interview, this time on camera. He looked healthy. He said he was writing a book about his kidnapping. He denied being a traitor. Soviet officials paraded him before foreign journalists to prove he was alive. Western intelligence analysts studied the footage. They used facial recognition and voice analysis. Everything matched. Vitaly Yurchenko was alive. He was living in Moscow. He was working for the KGB. This was unprecedented. The debate began immediately. People questioned if Yurchenko's entire defection was a KGB operation. They wondered if he had been sent to deceive the Central Intelligence Agency, or perhaps he was a genuine defector who simply changed his mind. The fake defection theory had supporters. This theory suggested the KGB would send a high-ranking officer to defect. He would then reveal carefully selected intelligence. Afterward, he would return to Moscow claiming he had been kidnapped. The intelligence he provided would be believed because it came from a defector. His return would humiliate the Central Intelligence Agency. The redefection would also demoralize other potential Soviet defectors. It would show that the Central Intelligence Agency could not protect them. But there were problems with the theory. First, the intelligence Yurchenko provided was real. Edward Lee Howard was a genuine Central Intelligence Agency traitor. Yurchenko's information led to Howard's exposure and subsequent escape. That was not disinformation. That was burning a valuable asset. Ronald Pelton was a genuine National Security Agency spy. His arrest and conviction were based on Yurchenko's information. The Soviets lost access to National Security Agency communications intelligence because Yurchenko revealed Pelton. That is not something the KGB would sacrifice for a disinformation operation. Second, the KGB did not typically use fake defectors. The propaganda cost for them was too high. Every Soviet defection to the West was an ideological defeat for the Soviet system. It suggested that people wanted to escape communism. The Soviet government hated defections and would never stage one voluntarily. Third, Yurchenko's personal behavior during the defection did not match a KGB plant. His obsession with Valentina Yeroskovsky was real. CIA officers who debriefed him believed his emotional breakdown after she rejected him was genuine. A KGB officer on a fake defection mission would not have arranged a romantic meeting with a woman who would reject him. That was not part of any script. Fourth, former KGB officers who later defected said Yurchenko was a real defector who got cold feet. These officers included Oleg Kalugin, a general in the 1st Chief Directorate. In interviews, Kalugin stated that the KGB does not send people on fake defections. He explained that Yurchenko genuinely defected. Then, according to Kalugin, Yurchenko changed his mind. Kalugin noted that this happens. He added that defecting is hard. People leave everything behind. And sometimes they regret it. So the theory that Yurchenko was a genuine defector who redefected had its own evidence. Yurchenko's depression was real. Multiple CIA handlers documented it. His excessive drinking was also a factor. He had an obsession with Valentina. He complained about feeling imprisoned. He realized he had destroyed his life for a woman who did not love him. When Valentina rejected him in October 1985, Yurchenko's motivation for defecting evaporated. He had betrayed his country, his career, and his family for nothing. In America, he was nobody. He was merely a defector. He became dependent on CIA money. His identity remained concealed. He saw no real future there. In the Soviet Union, however, he was somebody. He was a KGB colonel. He was a patriot who had escaped American kidnappers. He could be a propaganda hero. The choice was not hard. He walked out of a Georgetown restaurant, then he went home. The truth, as it emerged over the following decades, seems to be this. Vitaly Yurchenko genuinely defected in August 1985. His motivations were personal, not ideological. He was depressed and in love with a woman he could not have. He was also drowning in alcohol and regret. Defecting seemed like an escape. He provided genuine intelligence to the CIA. Edward Lee Howard and Ronald Pelton were real spies. The operational details he revealed were accurate. He cooperated fully, but after Valentina rejected him, he realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. He had no future in America, only exile, Isolation and regret awaited him there. The CIA mishandled him. Colin Thompson, his primary handler, was described by multiple sources as cold and bureaucratic. The safe house felt like prison. The debriefings were grueling. Nobody at the CIA understood that Yurchenko needed emotional support as much as operational debriefing. When Yurchenko walked out of the restaurant on November 2nd, he made a calculated decision. If he returned to Moscow and claimed he had been kidnapped, the Soviet government might believe him, or at least they might pretend to believe him. This gave them political cover. They could use his escape as propaganda. This also meant Yurchenko might avoid execution. It worked. The KGB welcomed him back. They did not believe his kidnapping story. They knew he had defected voluntarily. However, his return was politically valuable. It embarrassed the CIA. It showed that Soviet officers could escape American captivity. It suggested American intelligence used illegal methods, so they did not execute him. Instead, they gave him his old job back. They certainly kept him under watch. However, he was alive and useful. Yurchenko worked for the KGB until its dissolution in 1991. According to former CIA officer Pete Bagley, Yurchenko was still working in Moscow as late as 2002. He was possibly working in private security. If he is still alive in 2025, he would be 89 years old. Nobody knows for certain. The man who walked into the Soviet embassy in November 1985 disappeared into Moscow's shadows. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs. He made no public appearances. The damage assessment from Yurchenko's defection was complex. On one hand, the intelligence he provided was invaluable. Edward Lee Howard was exposed even though he escaped. Ronald Pelton was arrested and convicted. The CIA learned critical details about KGB methods that improved American counterintelligence. On the other hand, his redefection was a disaster. The CIA's mishandling of Yurchenko became a case study in how not to manage defectors. The agency revised its procedures for handling Soviet defectors. They improved housing, psychological support, and handler training. The biggest impact, though, was on other potential defectors. Soviet intelligence officers considering defection now had a cautionary tale. The CIA could not protect them. The CIA could not keep them happy. If they changed their mind, perhaps they could go home and survive. It is impossible to know how many Soviet officers decided not to defect because of Yurchenko's example. But the number was probably significant. The Yurchenko case also exposed a deeper problem. The CIA would not discover this problem for another 9 years. Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who had debriefed Yurchenko in August 1985, was a Soviet spy. He had started spying for the KGB in April 1985, 4 months before Yurchenko defected. When Yurchenko provided information about KGB operations, Ames was in the room taking notes. He was also passing everything to his KGB handlers. The KGB knew exactly what Yurchenko was revealing. This was because Ames was telling them in real time. They knew which operations were compromised. They also knew which officers were exposed. Furthermore, they knew which methods were revealed. This raises a disturbing possibility. Did the KGB encourage Yurchenko to redefect because Aldrich Ames had already told them everything Yurchenko revealed? If the KGB knew the damage was done, Yurchenko's return became a propaganda opportunity. It also came with minimal additional security cost. We may never know. Ames was arrested in 1994 and sentenced to life in prison. He has given multiple interviews over the years. However, he has never discussed Yurchenko in detail. The full truth of Vitaly Yurchenko's defection and redefection remains classified. CIA files on the case are still mostly sealed. Soviet KGB records, if they exist, have not been released. What we know comes from declassified CIA documents. It also comes from congressional investigations, interviews with former intelligence officers, and journalists who covered the case. The lessons, though, are clear. First, motivation matters. Yurchenko defected for personal reasons, not ideological ones. When his personal motivation disappeared, so did his commitment to defection. The CIA learned to better assess why someone is defecting. They also learned whether that motivation will sustain them through the difficult adjustment period. Second, psychological support matters. Defecting is traumatic. You leave your country, your culture, your language, and your identity. Everything familiar is gone. The CIA improved its psychological support for defectors after Yurchenko. They provided better counseling and integration assistance. Third, handlers matter. Colin Thompson, by most accounts, was a competent intelligence officer. However, he was a poor handler for someone as emotionally fragile as Yurchenko. The CIA revised its selection process for handlers. They emphasized interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence. Fourth, security matters, but so does freedom. Yurchenko felt like a prisoner at the Virginia safe house. The laser alarms, guards, and isolation made him feel controlled. The CIA learned to balance security with autonomy. They gave defectors more freedom while still protecting them. Fifth, the intelligence war never ends. While the CIA was debriefing Yurchenko about Soviet operations, Aldrich Ames was in the room. He was selling American operations to the Soviets. The Cold War was a hall of mirrors. Nobody knew who was really on which side. Sixth, propaganda matters. The Soviets turned Yurchenko's redefection into a propaganda victory. The narrative of a kidnapped Soviet officer played well internationally. This was particularly true in countries skeptical of American intelligence methods. The CIA learned to better manage the public relations aspects of defections. Seventh, nothing is ever certain in espionage. Was Yurchenko real or fake? The debate continues 40 years later. Intelligence officers who worked the case disagree. Historians analyzing the evidence reach different conclusions. In espionage, certainty is a luxury. Ambiguity is the norm. Today, the Yurchenko case is taught at CYA training facilities. It serves as a case study in defector management. Instructors discuss what went right and what went wrong. They also teach how to avoid repeating the mistakes. Au pied de cochon, the Georgetown restaurant where Yurchenko walked out on Colin Thompson, closed years ago. It is now a pizza chain. A small plaque on the wall commemorates the location's role in Cold War history. Few passers-by know what happened there. The CIA safe house in Virginia where Yurchenko was debriefed is long gone. Its location remains classified. Edward Lee Howard died in Moscow in 2002. He allegedly fell downstairs at his dacha. He was 50 years old. The circumstances surrounding his death remain suspicious. Ronald Pelton served 30 years in federal prison. He was released in 2015. He died in 2022 at age 80. His payday of $35,000 cost American intelligence billions in compromised operations. Colin Thompson continued his CIA career. He retired from the agency in the 1990s. Details of his later career remain classified. Aldrich Ames is serving life in federal prison in Pennsylvania. He is 77 years old. He has given multiple interviews over the years, always maintaining he has no regrets. He sold CIA operations to the Soviets for $2.7 million. This occurred between 1985 and 1994. At least 10 CIA assets were executed because of his betrayal, and Vitaly Yurchenko, he remains a mystery. The last confirmed sighting was in 2002. Former CIA officials reported he was working in Moscow then. If he is alive today, he would be 89 years old. He would be living somewhere in Russia. Perhaps he is retired. Perhaps he is still working in some capacity. Nobody is talking. The man gave the CIA 5,000 pieces of intelligence. He exposed 2 American spies. Then, 3 months later, he walked back to the Soviet embassy. He then vanished into history. His story remains one of the strangest episodes of the Cold War. It was a defection that might have been real or might have been fake. It was a redefection that might have been planned or might have been spontaneous. It involved a KGB colonel who might have been a traitor or might have been a hero. In the end, the Yurchenko case taught American intelligence a hard lesson. In espionage, people are the most unpredictable variable. You can secure the communications, you can encrypt the files, you can build the perfect safe house, but you cannot predict the human heart. Vitaly Yurchenko defected because he loved a woman who did not love him back. When that dream died, so did his defection. He walked out of a Georgetown restaurant because he realized he had destroyed his life for nothing. He walked back into the Soviet embassy because going home, even to an uncertain fate, was better. It was better than living in exile with nothing but regret. The CIA learned from its mistakes. Defector handling improved. Psychological support got better. The procedures changed. But the fundamental truth remained. In the intelligence war, the human element is always the wild card. Yurchenko proved it. 40 years later, we are still trying to understand what really happened. If this story mattered to you, please do something for me right now. Please hit the like button. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people. Stories like this do not get told unless people like you make them visible. Please hit subscribe and click the notification bell. We are pulling stories like this from declassified CIA archives, congressional investigations, and forgotten Cold War files every week. These are stories of real defections. They are stories of real betrayals and real people who changed history. Please drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from. Are you in the United States? Russia? Europe? Australia? This community is global. Or just tell me what you think. Was Yurchenko real or fake? Was he a genuine defector or a KGB plant? The debate continues 40 years later. You are not just a viewer. You are part of preserving Cold War history. You are making sure cases like Yurchenko's are not forgotten. You are honoring the people who lived through these impossible situations, whether they were heroes or traitors. Our community is growing every day. People from around the world are fascinated by the secret history of the intelligence war. These are people who understand that espionage is not like the movies. It is messy, human, complicated, and often tragic. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. Thank you for making sure history remembers not just the headlines, but the human beings behind them. Vitaly Yurchenko gave the Central Intelligence Agency critical intelligence, then walked away. His reasons remain debated. His fate remains mysterious. His story remains unforgettable. See you in the next story.